Thank you all. And thank you, Bob. I didn't plan to spend much of our half an hour together talking football, but I think Bob just obliged me to. First of all, when we came into the dinner, the Huskers were down 42-10 in Happy Valley early in the third quarter. So that weeping and wailing that you heard outside, that was my daughter and me trying to decide if we could really go out in public. Nebraska is the winningest team of the last 50 years in college football, as many of you may know, but that's because we were really good from 50 years ago until about 16 years ago, and we've had a dry spell. So good to be with all of you. He also then went after Midland Lutheran, where I used to lead, and the Red Raiders. If there's ever been a scandal-laced steroids crisis that needs to be investigated in Iowa football, the Red Raiders have an offensive line that Kirk Ferentz would covet. So I don't know what's going on up in Orange City, but there's all sorts of rules violations. When I was a kid, my dad was a high school football and wrestling coach. He's retired now, but we'd look across the river to Iowa, and we used to think of Iowa as a place. I was a wrestler. Football's my love, but I was actually good at wrestling, and football I was pretty mediocre. So we'd look at Iowa, and we would think inferior football, superior wrestling. Now we look across the border to Iowa, and we just focus on the superior wrestling. And we just leave it at that. But Matt mentioned that he drives Uber occasionally. I drive Uber occasionally. I'm one of 5 people in the U.S. Senate that has never been a politician before. And I find that I love doing town halls. I learn a lot. But not everybody in a populace of Nebraska or Iowa comes to town halls. It's a unique niche of people who go to political town halls. And when you're new in politics and you want to listen to and learn from your constituents, you want to talk to more people than just the subset that would come to town halls. So I do a ton of work tours. I'll be working on a garbage truck Monday and Tuesday this week. I got to drive a cement mixer recently, so I'm really popular with my 6-year-old son. And I love to work like chain gangs at high school football games. And in the new sharing economy, it turns out it's hard to figure out what these new jobs are going to look like. And at one point tonight, we might talk about that a little bit. But I ended up starting driving Uber about a year and a half ago in Nebraska. And you learn a lot. And as Matt said, you actually learn more driving Uber on a Saturday night. Because from 5 to 7 to 9 to 11 o'clock, you learn a whole different set of stuff about the people of America. And after Nebraska lost to Iowa last year in the football game, I lost a bet, and I had to drive Uber in Des Moines last July because of losing last November. But you can see that I'm not wise because my side of the bet was even stupider. I agreed to wear Iowa Hawkeye gear if Iowa beat Nebraska. So I had to turn up in Des Moines last July wearing full Hawkeye gear. At 5 o'clock, people were really hospitable, and they thought it was funny. By 11 o'clock at night, there was just so much taunting going on in every selfie that I was asked to take with people. So you do learn a lot driving Uber. As we start, let me just tell you up front, I have great joy at the way Bob kicked off his part of this event tonight because it dovetails, we didn't compare notes, but it dovetails with some of what I'd like to spend our time together talking about. I have no intention of talking about 2016 at all tonight, or frankly 2012 or 2020 or 2024. I have no intention of talking about Republicans and Democrats tonight. Because frankly, one of the things that's great about civically engaged Americans is we understand that it's almost a little bit un-American to organize your life around 24-hour news cycles or around 2 or 4 year even-numbered or quadrennial election years. America is made up of a people who think in decades and in centuries, not in terms of political addiction and political consumption and short-term election ways of thinking about the world. We went to the moon in a decade. We built the American century. Our founders built this nation that they've bequeathed to us on timeless truths. For goodness sakes, we call it the American dream. I think that it is a wonderful thing to see this many people who are engaged on a Saturday night for civic health and for public-mindedness, and for love of neighbor in the public square, but not just narrowly about elections. Because who we are as a people are not primarily things that are defined by what happens in the Iowa State Capitol or the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. Government is really important to provide a framework for ordered liberty, But most of everything that's really, really interesting in the world can't be done by compulsion, can't be done by force. And that's really the domain of government. Government's tools are the tools of power. And we believe in things that are much more human, much more fully textured. We believe in love. And so if you really believe in neighborliness, you want to think about the interplay of, I think in the video a little bit ago, of those three circles of church and state or government and home. But you think about the church and the home as institutions that ultimately are about freedom too. Government is mostly about freedom from. The main things that government does is provide that framework for ordered liberty to protect us from all the stuff that's broken in the world. The world is broken. The fall that we know in our houses and in the church and obviously in the public square, that fall means that there are people who do want to take your life and your liberty and your stuff. And so we do want there to be someone who wields the sword to try to protect us from physical violence. But the main thing that the state does is maintain that order in the public square so that you can then use your freedom to love people and to persuade people and to argue with people and to invite them into your church and to persuade them to marry you or to buy your mousetrap or your app or to join your venture philanthropy project or your Rotary Club or to donate to the family leader. All these freedom to things are things that happen when you actually act by persuasion on people who have souls, not just people who have bodies and unkept, unmanaged, undisciplined arms and legs that want to run roughshod over somebody else's freedom. The really interesting things are the things that happen by persuasion and by love and by voluntarism. So happily, though we're going to talk about a lot of civic things together tonight, I'm not primarily talking about governmental things. And I think that that is a freeing thing on a Saturday night for civically minded people, to be free from an obsession with short-term politics. I think that so much of what's wrong in our time, and we should recognize that we do live in an extraordinary time, for both good and for ill. There's all sorts of churn and change in our moment. But in the extraordinary elements of the time in which we live, there is ultimately lots and lots of opportunity to build and to persuade. There's a lot that needs to be done in government. But the most important crises that we face in our time and place are really not crises that can be reduced to Republican versus Democrat. For the 535 people that I work with, we actually aren't that interesting. The really, really important debates of our time, the really big things that we need to do, really can't be reduced to a political spectrum of right versus left, but rather the really big crises of our time and place are about our present obsessions against both past and future. Because we live in a time of great historical amnesia. We live at a time where we don't know what we're trying to preserve from the past. We're not very good at passing this stuff on to our kids and grandkids right now. And we live at a time where we don't have a lot of shared understanding of what we need to build for the future. I'm a historian by background. So Bob mentioned that I was a college president before I ran for the Senate, I guess 3 years ago. I ran from the summer of 13 through November of 14. My wife and I, our three kids, girls then 12, 10, boy was 2. Today we're 16, 13, and 6. We lived on and off a campaign bus for about 16 months. We had an extraordinary time. But as we were wrestling through why we would run, one of the ways we said it at our house is we want to run to displace somebody else who's a political addict. We want to run because we have a 1 cheer for government view of the world, and we think there are way too many people who have a 3 cheers for government view of the world. And if you want to have a 3 cheers for family, if you want to have a 3 cheers for neighborhood, if you want to have a 3 cheers for church, if you want to have a 3 cheers for family leader and other civic institutions like this view of the world, then you need to make sure that government doesn't displace all that. And so when we were running, we tried to regularly say, I don't want to do this if I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. and begin to think that Washington, D.C. is the center of the world. I don't believe that. 5 of the 7 richest counties in America now are the suburbs that ring Washington, D.C. That's a pretty good indicator that the way we're supposed to be living civic life and localism and neighborliness, the way we're supposed to be living limited government, but separated both vertically and horizontally, where Des Moines and your city council and your county board are supposed to be making most of the decisions that matter in life, not Washington, D.C., and of those decisions that are in Washington, D.C., distinguishing between legislative, executive, and judicial functions, so limited government separated at the horizontal and at the vertical level. If you have 5 of the 7 richest counties in America being where all the lobbyists live surrounding Washington, D.C., that's a pretty good sign that we're not doing America right. So I want us to take a little bit of time tonight and try to set aside right versus left, though there's a lot on right versus left that matters. Abortion and the life movement being so near and dear to many of us in this room, obviously. There are issues right versus left that matter. But most of the really big crises that we face really are about the fact that we live in a time of such extraordinary churn that we haven't figured out how to anchor ourselves and deliberate with our neighbors about what are we preserving from the past and what's changing for the future. So when I say that I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about 2016 or 2020 or 2024, it's because it's 2017, and the American way of thinking is 2027, 2037, 2047. We should have a much greater time horizon. My 6-year-old boy will only be beginning to drive. Actually, we live in the country, so we get to manipulate the school permit stuff a little bit. But when I look ahead 10 years till 2027, it sounds a long way in the future in terms of political history. But in terms of the lives of what really matters to all of us in this room, and frankly to all of our neighbors as well, what we really care about is the world that we're leaving to our kids and grandkids. Well, I want to talk about 3 big challenges. One is about work, the transformation of work. One is about what's happening in our communities. And the third is, do our kids have any understanding of the American civic project? Do they know the First Amendment? All 3 of these challenges are huge, and they're never really discussed in the place where I work right now. When you think about where we sit in the future of work, throughout almost all of human history, until about 150 years ago, there wasn't even job choice. Hunter-gatherers and agrarianism, the rise of true agriculture from about 11,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran today, from about 10,000 years ago until about 150 years ago in the Industrial Revolution, all of economic and work history passed. All the nomadic hunter-gatherers and all the people who had built farms didn't even have a conception of job choice. Think about that for a minute. Moms, dads, grandmas, grandpas, think about your kids and how we reflect on their adolescence and your grandkids, and how we think about the questions we ask them when they're 8 and 10 and 12 and 14. What do you want to do with your life? What do you want to be? Right? These are really modern questions. For almost all of human history, you didn't have picking a job. You had becoming 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 and doing more of what mom and dad and grandma and grandpa did, which is either chase the buffalo or plant and harvest. That's what you did, right? Some people were called to the ministry. It's an old profession. About 200 years ago, law became a specialized discipline. Medicine, to a slightly lesser degree, about 150 to 200 years ago. There were some sort of traveling witch doctors. But by and large, almost everybody just did what their parents and grandparents did. The Industrial Revolution 150 years ago changed that, and people migrated across oceans, or they left the countryside and they went to cities. To put that in perspective, at the end of the Civil War, 86% of Americans live and work on the farm. 86% of people live and work on the farm in 1865. By World War II, 60% of people live and work in cities. So you go from 6 out of 7 on the farm to 3 out of 5 in cities over about 70 years. And that's really where job choice and specialization and job change comes from for the first time. And it disrupted America in really, really radical ways. It created cities, it created progressivism in politics, it created all sorts of new things. But even though there was this bipartisan agreement among elites, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, thought America probably can't work in cities because there'll be too much anonymity. There won't be virtue. There won't be known transparency of relationships. Your word won't be your bond. Today, most people in our society, and even most people in this room, wouldn't be in favor of prohibition as a legal policy, right? And yet 110 years ago, 110 years ago, 100 years ago, as prohibition was being debated, it wasn't actually that controversial as that amendment was passed. Why? Because there really were drunk Irish kids passed out everywhere in the streets of American cities. There really was a sense that neighborliness wouldn't be known in cities the way it had been known on the countryside. And so there was this massive disruption in American life 100 years ago. And what was it about? It was about people leaving the countryside, moving to cities, and having to pick a new specialized profession, though no one in human history had ever really done that. Highly disruptive. And yet a little bit less disruptive than people thought it would be, because once people got their new job, they kept it until death or retirement. You know the world we're entering right now? It's the world that all of our ancestors were scared to death about 100 years ago. We're entering a world of perpetual churn and change and new job formation over and over and over again in the course of the lives of our kids and grandkids and our neighbors' kids and grandkids. And people are scared. If you haven't thought much about the AI revolution and the machine learning revolution and the digital learning revolution that's coming, let me just give you one stat for how to think about it. In 37 out of 50 states in America today, what do you think the number one job is? Number one job in 37 out of 50 states in America is driver. Many folks in Silicon Valley believe almost 2/3 of all driving jobs will be eliminated within the next 10 years. Think about that. Think about the angst and the turmoil we feel among a lot of our neighbors if you hear of somebody, a breadwinner for a family at 40 or 45 getting laid off, and what that feels like. Now imagine a spiking curve where that becomes the experience of almost everybody you know. During the Industrial Revolution and during the rise of cities 100, 150 years ago, there was one moment of job change. 15 to 25-year-old males migrated to cities and they had to get a job. They didn't just keep the same job on the farm that dad and mom and uncle and grandpa had. All of a sudden, you went to cities and you had to get a specialized job. But it turned out once they got the job in the factory, they kept it until death or retirement. I was a college president from 2009 to 2014, and I used to meet with demographers and economists a lot to try to understand the world that the graduates from our school were going to enter into when they left. And one of the stats that blew my mind, I learned this in 2012, the average graduate of a small college in the Midwest was not just going to change jobs, they were going to change industries 3 times in their first 10 years after college. We are entering a world where not one of your neighbors is going to get disintermediated out of their job or their firm, but their whole industry and their skill set when they're 40 or 45 or 50. Not one of them, but most of them. When you want to think about the opioid crisis, Nebraska and Iowa have been sheltered a little bit from this, but we know the destructive powers of meth in a lot of our communities. But when you look at what is happening in the opioid crisis in America, if you've ever read mortality or demographic tables about what happens to disrupt people's lives, for a long time in the US, birth defects kill a decent number of people before age 1. But then from age 1 to 45, male and female, both sides of this chart for decades have been filled with number one killer of 1-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and on to 45 and a little bit higher was car wrecks. And then after 45, you start to have cancer and heart disease start to pop up on the chart. And then eventually you get to the place where those are the dominant killers and you're 70 and you're 75 and you're 80, and then Alzheimer's comes into those charts. Right now you look at these tables and you have opioids and suicide and drug overdose starting to pop up on these charts on a whole bunch of categories of people under 45 years old. There are a whole bunch of causes of this problem, but one of the most fundamental ones is there's lots and lots less certainty of how, if you're a 15 or an 18 or a 21 or a 24-year-old kid, young adult coming of age, how you do the right thing and get a job and you'll be able to provide for a family. Our neighbors have lots and less certainty that that's going to happen for them, and opioids are one of the explanations for what happens when you have that panic. Right now, if you're 45 and you lose your job, by and large, you never get employed again. We're heading into a world where when lots and lots of people are going to be disintermediated out of jobs at age 45 and 50, we're going to have to figure out how to become a civilization of lifelong learners, although nobody in human history has ever done that before. The historian in me says that's a pretty daunting task. Usually, when you're a historian, your job is to be kind of a skunk at a garden party. People are always saying, oh, well, this is amazing. We're going through, phenomenon X or movement Y, and this is unprecedented in human history. And usually the historian's job is to kind of go over by the punch bowl and sheepishly go, yeah, actually, lots more continuity in human history than discontinuity. It just turns out that you're here and you're a narcissist, and so you think that this moment is truly unprecedented, but that's not really what's happening. Usually there's just lots more continuity. It's just a boring story to say at a party. Well, we are entering a time where what's going to happen to work is truly unprecedented in human history. What are we going to do about it? There's lots and lots of great things happening because of these technological revolutions as well. Because of advances in medical technology, for instance, poverty is plummeting around the world. The share of people that live in abject poverty was still about 99% of the 800 million people on the earth 250 years ago. In the late 1700s, still about 1800, about 800 million people on earth, 99% of people lived in abject poverty, defined as, if you have a really big harvest, might I die? Excuse me, might I die this winter? I may not have a storehouse and enough grain that's big enough that I know I can make it through a bad season. Only kings and the very rich sort of lawyers and bankers of certain European cities were wealthy enough to have certainty that they could live for a year if the weather was bad and if the harvest was bad. Today, there are 7.2 billion people on Earth. Almost 6.5 billion of us around the globe are rich enough to know that we're sure through next year, regardless of what happens in this year's harvest. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary thing. Medical technologies are doing amazing things to eliminate some death by certain diseases and to mitigate suffering. But as we're going to go from 7.2 to 9 billion people on Earth over the next 30 years, we're probably also simultaneously going to go from a world where we need 3.5 or 4 billion workers to maybe only 3 or 2.5 billion workers. What are we going to do when we don't have a lot of clarity about what work there is for people? And by we, I don't chiefly mean the federal government again. I mean we. I mean us in this room. What are you going to do when your brother or my brother or your uncle or your neighbor's kid don't know how to find work? Because one of the things that we know, and this is a universal truth. This one, we're going to talk a little bit about our Christian identity here tonight before we're done. But this is a universal truth that everybody created in the image of God. It turns out across time and place, one of the most fundamental drivers of human happiness is whether or not you have meaningful work. There's almost no higher correlate to human happiness than on Monday morning when you leave home, do I think anybody needs me? If you've got meaningful work, you're almost certainly going to be happy in life. And if you don't have meaningful work, you're almost certainly not going to be happy in life. And by meaningful work, I don't mean, do you make a lot of money? I don't mean, does my back or my ankles or my knees hurt at the end of the day? I don't mean, is there some jackwagon 3 cubicles over that talks really loudly and annoys me? I mean, do I think somebody needs me? Does my work matter? Am I living out a life of gratitude to God where I can do something to serve my community? And this isn't just busy work. I'm needed. I have a calling. The Christian way of saying it is, do you have a vocation? We're entering a world where there's going to be lots less work. Now, I also believe in this human revolution that is digitization. Going from hunter-gatherers to farming, farming to industrialization, the big tool economy. We're going through a revolution from the big tool economy to we don't know what. The mobile economy, the IT economy, the portable economy, the service economy, the digital economy. Sociologists and economists have given up trying to name it. They now just call it the post-industrial economy, which is the after the last thing. Which is another way of saying we don't really have categories for this. Imagine if during the rise of the cities and during industrialization in 1890, 1900, and 1910, we didn't know where we were headed. So we didn't call it industrialization. We just called it the post-agricultural economy. We don't know what it is. We don't need you on the farm. Once you move to the cities, you all figure it out. Well, what we're going through now is that kind of disruption in the nature of work, which disrupts human communities in ways that leave lots and lots of people feeling really placeless. Well, guess what? If you feel placeless, you're scared, and you're looking for tribe. And right now, we have lots and lots of our neighbors who are hurting because they're looking for tribe, and they don't think they're needed. They don't think they have a place. And so The second challenge of our moment, besides figuring out what comes next in the nature of work, is figuring out what comes next in neighborhoods, what comes next in community. Because we have an epidemic of loneliness among us right now. Epidemiologists think the greatest public health challenge of our time is loneliness. The average American has gone from having about 3.2 friends 25 years ago to about 1.8 friends today. Think about that. By friends here, I mean this not in the goofy way we talk in the US Senate. My good friend from the state of Rhode Island, whose head I'm about to tear off in this debate. We don't mean it in the way that you use friend on Facebook or social media. There was a study done recently in the UK, a longitudinal study. How many friends do you have on social media? The average Brit, and they are more likely to live in neighborhoods that have some density and duration than we have, so our problems are probably bigger than theirs, but the average Brit has 237 Facebook friends. When interviewed, how many people in the world can you count on in a time of crisis? What do you think the average answer is? Both the mean and the modal answer is 2. 237 Facebook friends. But if there's a crisis, if my kid's hit by a car, if my kid does something terrible and I'm ashamed, if I get cancer, if I get laid off, how many people do I think I can go to in a time of crisis? And the average answer is 2. The average American adult, or not the average, 40% of American adults say they have 0 confidants. They have no one they can talk to anything important about. I would submit to you, brothers and sisters, that one of the challenges of our time is that we're going through a massive disruption in the most basic of human anchors, work and place. And we don't really know what comes next, but there's enough fear in our souls that people are looking for somebody to blame and somebody to say, you better solve this thing, and if this thing isn't soluble, I at least want to be able to say it was your fault. And so one of the problems with our politics at this time is that we don't talk honestly about what things government might be able to do and what things government can't conceivably do. The vast majority of really interesting things in life can't be solved by government. But right now we've got so little local community. We've got so few Aristotelian friends. By that I mean a friend as we understand it, a friend as Christians understand it, a friend as philosophy and Aristotle understood it. A friend is someone who, when they hurt, you hurt. When they're happy, when something good happens to them, you're happy. Not because you choose to, but just because you love them. It's who you are, right? When my kids, if my 16 and 13-year-old daughters, if something goes wrong in their day, I hurt. It's not a choice I make. I don't have any freedom not to hurt. It's just, they're a part of me. If my 6-year-old kid is flying down the street on his bike and he's happy, it's like the sun is shining on me. Everything is great in the world when you see your kid smiling ear to ear. That's what friendship is. But right now, in our time, there's a hollowing out of friendship. And so one of the things that's happening as we become less and less rooted is we're looking for tribe. And if we can't find tribe, well then maybe I'll at least do anti-tribe. And so I think that's really what's happening in our politics right now, is you got a whole bunch of people trying to load up and weigh down American politics with the line between good and evil being between these two political parties. Let me be clear, the people I work with, they're way too boring for you to project that much meaning on. Right? I mean, I believed before I went to Washington, D.C., that there were a whole bunch of really, really smart people, strategic, but some of them nefarious. But then you get there and you realize that institution is filled with a lot of pretty darn nice people, but that you wouldn't really hire them to lead anything. Right? The challenges of the moment that we face are much bigger than federal policy, which is trying to ride the chassis of 1965 entitlement programs and lie to you about the math as we bankrupt your kids and grandkids. The challenges of our time are much bigger than the things being debated in the halls of Washington, D.C. right now. But the good news is, except that we're not teaching it, the good news is there are deep reservoirs in America to try to go back to sources of wisdom that knew that America as an idea, America as an inspired meaning, America as a project, America as a republic is way bigger than our government. Think about the policy continuum from right to left as legislative fights here. But the meaning of America is this much larger civic understanding that overarches it. Margaret Thatcher used to say, Europe is filled with nations who've been formed by history, but America is the first nation ever birthed by philosophy. What does that mean? It means that America was different than other nations in the way we were founded. America was a project that had a creed. Our founders in Philadelphia in 1787 said some things that were incredibly hubristic. If you go back there and you think about those 50 to 60 folks sitting around in Philly arguing, they said, we mean this kind of gingerly, but we think everybody else who's ever been involved in governmental projects, basically through almost all of human history, we think they were all wrong. We think that every government before America used to start with the idea that because the world is broken, because we're sinners, because there are people who want to take your life and your liberty and your stuff, we need government. So far, so good. That's true. We need somebody to wield the sword to restrain evil, to punish evil, as was said in the video. That's true. But just because we need government doesn't mean government is the first institution. We don't believe, the American founders said, that government is the author or source of our rights. We believe that God is the author and source of our rights, and that we get our rights, our inalienable rights, from God via nature, and government is our shared project to secure those rights. So we, the people, come together and we build the government, and because our rights are limitless and the government only has a defined project, the government will be limited. And so the people are first, rights are first, human souls are first, and government only has a limited set of duties. That's a pretty glorious project, right? It's sort of like the way when you learn a foreign language, you start to understand your own language for the first time. You may not use your Dutch or your German or your French or your Spanish or your Mandarin or your Latin anymore. But if you ever had to learn one of those languages for real, what you realize is you get to look back on English and you all of a sudden start to understand some of the choices that are made in grammar and syntax and structure, vocabulary. You start to see your language in a new way because you were outside it. It's why a fish couldn't possibly explain water to you, right? Because he's never not been in water. It's why travel is such an important part of helping your 14 and your 16 and your 18-year-old come of age so they can start to challenge and evaluate some of the things in their community and the assumptions and conventions that they grew up with. Hopefully to re-embrace them, but to embrace them as theirs because now they understand them as something other than just the authority of mom and dad. At first they received those conventions and those rules on the authority of mom and dad, but eventually you want to have them receive them by embrace as well. And so you want to look back on it. In the same way, it's useful for us as Americans to sort of see how non-Americans see America. And the best translator of America that's ever been was Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to America in the 1830s and 40s and tried to make sense of America for Europeans who thought, this is weird. These people are economically vibrant, even though we just thought they were religious zealots living on the edge of the earth. Right? So the American founders, we have folks coming to North Carolina, Virginia, the Lost Colony, Roanoke, you have Jamestown, you have Plymouth, you have the rest of Cape Cod, you have all these settlements in Virginia and Massachusetts in the 1620s and 30s, and ultimately we have the American Revolution in the 1770s and the Constitution in the 1780s, and Europeans sort of looked at us and they said, this is interesting. There have never really been people who believed in principled pluralism before and didn't go to war all the time. These Americans seem to actually believe in souls. They differ on religion, they differ on heaven and hell, and yet instead of killing each other about it, they formed a polity together to protect each other's rights to be wrong on a lot of things. That's sort of a key part of the American project, that we don't agree on everything, so we protect each other's rights to argue and to debate and persuade. And by the way, I believe the Christian theological things I believe at the core of my being as far more important than anything I'm ever going to do in politics. But because I believe the things I believe about my sin and about Jesus' work to atone for my sin and to impute righteousness to me, and because I want to love and persuade my neighbor of those things, I would never try to use the state to do it, because the state's tools are swords, and ultimately souls have to be persuaded, not compelled. Our founders did all these things that created religious pluralism and diversity and debate and persuasion, and then bizarrely, in the 18 teens and 20s, we also had this economic revolution that's unbelievably dynamic. We have a canal revolution. We have the proto-putting out revolution, which is basically industrialization before there's a central assembly line where products move to a lot of different workshops. You have the railroad revolution coming. All these things happening in the 18 teens and 20s are fascinating to Europe because they just thought we were a bunch of religious freaks. And all of a sudden they see economic dynamism in America as well. And they said, we got to understand why this is. And Alexis de Tocqueville travels to America essentially as a travel writer to translate America to Europeans. If you own Democracy in America, it's a 1,500-page book. I say this as a history professor, you're authorized to destroy a book here. Rip the binding off the book. Don't read it as a 1,500-page book. Put paper clips every 7 pages and then just spread it out all over your house and read it like magazine articles. Because that's what he actually was writing. The book is pretty boring at 1,500 pages. It's great at like 10 7-page articles. And what Tocqueville discovered was, he said, well, if America has all this economic dynamism, it must be because they have the best bureaucrats. That was what the European mind thought. If anything works in a community, it must be because their government is really powerful and they're really blessed to have smart, all-knowing legislators who can decree everything. And so Tocqueville wanted to understand why America was dynamic economically, and so he comes to Washington, D.C. to try to find the meaning of America. And he gets to D.C. and he writes back to Europe and he goes, well, this is a fruitless exercise. This place is a swamp inhabited by people who don't work very hard and they're not that interesting. Not a lot has changed. And he then says, there are 25 states at the time, and he says, Washington can't be the center of America. And so he travels to 17 of the 25 state capitals to try to find the meaning of America. And he writes back to Europe and he says, I have found the meaning of America. It is the Rotary Club. It's the family leader. What he was saying was, we Europeans had this continuum from isolated individualism to government-organized community. And this continuum says you're either the Unabomber living alone in the woods in Montana, or you have to live next door to the government and covet power. He says it turns out Americans don't see the world that way. They believe in community, highly engaged communal people, but they believe in a community that's voluntary. They believe in churches and synagogues that compete, not that are funded by the government and where orthodoxy is defined by a legislative committee. They believe in you building a better mousetrap or a better app. They believe in you persuading people to marry you. They believe in people voluntarily giving to your venture philanthropy project or your Rotary exercise or to the Family Leader Annual Fund or Capital Campaign or Daniel Project. Tocqueville was describing a kind of America that is unbelievably dynamic and interesting, and that ultimately flows from a First Amendment where we say people with dignity and souls have inalienable rights. They have religious liberty, freedom of speech, press, assembly, protest, or the redress of grievances, the 5 great freedoms of the First Amendment. All those freedoms, they're one big nexus that flow from the idea that God and rights are first, and government is just a shared project to secure them. It's an unbelievable sort of potpourri that creates the kind of communities that can navigate even the kinds of job disruption that are coming in our time and place. Here's the problem. We don't teach any of that anymore. And so it turns out for 2 generations, basically since the late 60s, early 70s, we've stopped teaching our kids this, and they don't know it. It turns out on the left, religious liberty is almost completely rejected. Freedom of speech is being rejected by young people on the left. 41% of Americans under age 35, 41% of people under 35 tell pollsters they think the First Amendment is dangerous because you might use your freedom of speech to say something that would hurt somebody else's feelings. Actually, that's the whole point of America. Not to be intentionally rude and offensive, but to say that humans created with dignity by God, humans who are descended from a line of fallen parents and grandparents and great-grandparents all the way back to the Adamic fall, when we're fallen, we're not going to agree about everything. And so what you want to do is create a framework where we're protected from violence so then we can try to love each other and persuade each other and get each other involved in serving in the disability movement and the adoption movement and the Wilberforce moment of trying to end slavery. By the way, there are more slaves on earth today than at any point in all of human history. The tragic need to live in the line of Wilberforce has never been greater than it is at this moment. And the homeless, and X, and Y, and Z, there's cause after cause after cause where your neighbors created in the image of God are hurting, and they need to be loved, and they need to be served, and most all of that is ultimately done by neighbors and by communities. Unless we get on our high horse and say, well, look at what's wrong with the left, that they've done this to religious liberty and freedom of religion, or freedom of religion and freedom of speech, we should note that in the polling on the right, there's a huge movement on the right to not believe in freedom of the press. But it turns out if you don't have freedom of the press, you don't have freedom of speech. Because what the press really is not just some particular journalist you may be mad at today that you think is biased, but the freedom to write down the stuff that happened when you assembled and when you spoke. And so these freedoms, press, religion, speech, assembly, protest, they're all of one cloth. And we need to preserve that from the past and figure out what we need to build from the future, for the future. But right now, we don't think about the civics we're retaining from the past or the new work culture and the job retraining that we're going to need to do for mid-career folks in the future, because we've decided, we, Americans, have decided to squat in this moment and scream about politics as if these tribes are big enough for our ultimate loyalties. They're not nearly interesting enough. 20 years ago, about 14% of Americans thought the other political party was evil. 20 years ago, 14%. Last year, over 40% of both parties define the other party as evil. But you know what? We don't really believe it. We're just looking for somebody to scapegoat, because when you actually ask people, nobody believes in their own party either. I said I wasn't going to talk about Republicans and Democrats tonight. I'm not going to talk about them as good versus evil, but I am going to say something about them as boring. When you ask the American people, do you identify more as a Republican or more as a Democrat? When you force the choice, you don't give them the opportunity to say none of the above. When you force the choice, are you more Republican or more Democrat? 46% of people interrupt to say, I reject this question. The plurality winner, 46% of the American people say, I don't identify with either of those when you didn't give them the choice. It's 29% Democrat, 25% Republican, and 46% say none of the above. Well, then when you drill down and you ask the 29% Dem, who, by the way, are a lot younger than the 25% who are in my party, when you ask the 29 and the 25%, well, why are you a Republican and why are you a Democrat? 2/3 of people say the main reason is because they hate the other party more than the party that they identified as who they liked. So really, that's another way of saying it's single-digit Democrats and single-digit Republicans. And yet we're consuming media in a way, and by media, I mean all forms of the immediacy of the moment. We're consuming it as if maybe we can let the grand drama of human history play out in the halls of politics. It's not interesting enough, friends. The word secular has a very important meaning. Secular is not anti-Christian, as long as we understand that that Latin word secular has a limited purpose. What does secular mean? It means the here and now. That's what secular means. There are a whole bunch of things that are about the here and now. Politics are only about the here and now. Sadly, football is only about the here and now. As much as I am addicted to that secondary religion called football, I know that it is not ultimately eternal, right? But the secular only works if we are people who believe and have the habits of consumption like, and that our neighbors know to be people who believe in the hereafter, who believe in the already and the not yet. And so tonight I stand before you not primarily as a temporary public official affiliated with the Republican Party. I have that calling. It's an important calling. I'm glad that the people of Nebraska gave me that calling. But I stand before you tonight at this Christian event primarily as a Christian to say, brothers and sisters, if somebody interviewed your neighbors and my neighbors and they asked, does Joe or does Sally seem like somebody who actually believes that the kingdom is not of this world? Does Joe or Sally seem to be somebody who loves the block they live on more than they love the RNC or the DNC or Fox or MSNBC? Does Joe or Sally seem to be somebody whose real meaning in life is about trying to live a life of gratitude to God by serving their neighbor in a way that's identifiable at a place where embodied, actual, real, textured, hurting, suffering, lonely, scared, fearful neighbors about the future of their jobs, and not just their ability to put bread on the table, but their meaning and their service and their anchor and their place in the world. Do we seem to be people who love our neighborhoods more than we want to scream about politics on Facebook? I trust that that is true of most of you in this room, actually. But we know that we live at a time where lots and lots of people whose tribe is becoming hollower, and because we're people who are made to be relational, we got lots of people tempting us to anti-tribe, tempting us to, as Bob said in his opening tonight, to say, this election, this moment, is the most important moment in all of human history. Friends, there is no politician who's going to save America. Friends, there is no election that's going to transform your life to become so much better than it is right now and into all that you want it to be. There are definitely reasons to walk precincts and to sign people up and register them to vote, because elections can make things worse and elections can make things incrementally better. But let us be sure we live among our neighbors as people who know that we actually believe that we put not our hope in princes, except we believe that there is a prince who is yet to come, and we get the chance to live a life of gratitude that even if our politics are despoiled, there are still all sorts of callings I have in my neighborhood. And so we should be those kinds of people who can rank order our identities. I'm a Christian first. I'm a husband second. I'm a father third. I'm an American fourth. I'm a conservative. Somewhere like 37th in the line, I'm a Republican, right? And I say that not as somebody who's advocating for the mushy middle here. I have the third most conservative voting record in the US Senate. I'm one of only 5 people in the Senate who's never been a politician before, and I'm in that group of 3 to 5 to 8 people at the right end of the continuum that's constantly saying, why would we do this stupid thing with the taxpayers' money? So I am not making an argument for a mushy middle, but I'm saying that to be a good Christian, you're obligated to be on guard against political idolatry, because politics isn't the center of any of our lives. Politics isn't the pathway by which the kingdom comes. And oh, by the way, it isn't just as a Christian that you have this calling. It's as an American that you have this calling. Because what's great about America is that we know that the institutional pluralism of the places we live are the textured ways where kids are raised and where neighbors are served. Politics has its place. In that rank ordering of identities, I said, Christian, husband, father, I'm an American like you. I'm temporarily a public official, and I believe in conservative policy solutions, and I'm a Republican. But those things are to create a framework and maintain a framework for ordered liberty, to maintain the best of American civics past, so that we can go forward in that way that Thatcher said, in that way that Tocqueville said, as those Americans who believe in community, but a community of voluntarism. What does that mean? What is voluntarism? It's persuasion. It's love. It's neighborliness. It's an awareness of the ensouled place that your neighbors sit and live. We live at a fascinating time. We live at a time where the economic disruptions we're going to go through are going to create more net global outcome than anything anybody has ever imagined in all of human history past in terms of the net economic output of the world. And yet, how that redounds to the median family, the median household, the median mom and dad in America is going to be really, really disruptive. There's a whole bunch to build, but the best way to do that building is in neighborhoods of meaning and purpose and community and commitment and love. And we should be those who do the political service to do that tending and stewarding and that maintenance of that framework. But as Bob said at the beginning, we can't possibly do that as if it's the first thing. For the only way to be a good citizen, the only way, from my point of view, I know we're a nonpartisan organization, the only way to be a good Republican is to be a great American first. And a great American doesn't put politics anywhere near the center of our identity, because we know that what really matters is the eternal souls of your neighbors and the kids and grandkids that they're trying to raise, and that ultimately 2027, 2037, and 2047 are far more interesting than 2016, 2020, and 2024. On behalf of all those Tocquevillians in American history past, thanks for what you're doing at the Family Leader. This is a special organization where you have the opportunity to come together and celebrate public-minded civic engagement that starts with an awareness of neighbors who have eternal souls, and you seek to live a life of gratitude to God by serving them where they are in your neighborhoods. Thanks for having me. A real pleasure.